Watch out, everyone. I've had caffeine this morning. And if anybody knows me well, they know that's trouble. And I might make it through this in about 10 minutes. So if I start talking too fast, I want somebody to be like, slow down. Oh, it's good to see you all this morning. I hope you got enough sleep after that last, the hour we were cheated from. I think that's why I needed the caffeine. There's so much to talk about when it comes to The Shadow, which is the series that we started last week. Kent introduced us to the concept last week and particularly focused on how do we define it and how does it factor into our individual lives. And I want to continue that thread and explore a few ways that it shows up in our culture. And there are mirrors everywhere. We talked about a few of them this morning in the 9 o'clock, and they're constantly reflecting back to us what we don't want to see about ourselves and about human nature. So this morning, I'm going to touch on 4 of those mirrors and then leave you a couple of ideas of what to learn from them or how we can learn from them. So this first mirror is cleverly shown to us through a commercial. Often the media, advertisers, marketing is reflecting something about our shadow back to us. And it's from 2014, and I never thought I would be saying all of this in front of an audience, and I'm probably going to use the word sex a few too many times during this talk. But this commercial from 2019 was for Summer's Eve body wash. And if you're not familiar, Summer's Eve is a brand of feminine hygiene products. We know that soap is soap, and that if we have a gender-specific soap, it's mostly a marketing ploy. So in this commercial, there's a woman applying her makeup in the mirror, and there's a rather, buff-looking man in the shower. We just see his torso, and he's generously lathering up with this body wash and seeming to enjoy it. And she's putting on her makeup, and she says, "Oh, I just love my Summer's Eve body wash. It's so, it's so wonderful. And, by the way, did you know that that's what you're using right now?" Does this sound familiar to anyone? Have you seen it? And so his eyes, he stops mid-lather, and his eyes get kind of big, and the music escalates into this sort of heavy metal mood. And then all of a sudden, it switches, and we watch the man go through a series of masculine affirming activities. He splits wood. He eats a raw egg. He bangs on some drums. He hits a punching bag. He does a belly flop in the pool. He karate chops a stack of wood planks with his bare hands. He pulls a car with a rope with his teeth. He forges a gladiator mask, and then he proceeds to mow the lawn wearing that gladiator mask, while the wife just sort of stands on the porch sipping her coffee and watching him. And then back in the house, he plops down on the couch, takes the final swig of his beer, crushes it with his hands, and then the woman says, "That was close." So, this is not just one of the funniest commercials in the history of commercials. It's a reflection of one of the biggest shadow sides of our society. These concepts of masculine and feminine have been used to divide us and keep us in these little boxes that feed our capitalistic society. And they've also done tremendous harm to our LGBTQ friends. Western culture has used the Bible and religion as both an excuse and a threat to keep us in our gender roles, which has resulted in tremendous power indifferences and an unintegrated, to use one of those shadow terms, society. If we were more fully integrated with our gender, we wouldn't see an aisle of pink and green products for the women and black and red products for the men. That said, we do respond with appropriate confusion when a company introduces a really ridiculous gender-specific item, like a pen, which is actually true. Some company decided, let's make a pen for women. Or when companies embrace what they call a pink it and shrink it marketing strategy, which means let's just take an ordinary item, make it pink and make it smaller, and market it to women. They think that that's going to make it more attractive to us. But we're so conditioned about this division and this divide of the world into pink and blue that we scarcely notice it anymore. That commercial that I just talked about is so funny because it is a huge exaggeration, but it's also true. For the man in the commercial, any hint of the feminine within him scares him. It's likely that his feminine energy has been stuffed into his shadow side. He knows it's there on some level because it's there in all of us. It's a universal energy, whether you like it or not, and whether you own it or not. Now, women are not without their own masculine-feminine shadow imbalance. We're taught to repress what are typically characterized as masculine traits: assertiveness, anger, sexual appetite. Those are just a few of them. And when those traits aren't honored or allowed to be channeled in healthy ways, they'll come out as passive aggressiveness, or maybe adopting a victim mentality, or promiscuity, among other consequences. In the 9 o'clock, it came up one way that it shows up where a woman can't express that assertiveness was when what we saw during the 2016 debates between Hillary and Trump, when Trump was sort of looming and hovering behind her while she was talking. And Leslie was pointing out that, she didn't stop. She just sort of ignored him and just kept talking while he's there. And what would it, the assertive response would be, what are you doing? Get back on your own side. But that probably wasn't okay. And if she had done that, I wonder what would have happened. There probably would have been a lot of women saying, you go, girl. But then we also know what the other response would be. The fact that many of us keep these different aspects of our masculine and feminine energies hidden and disowned leads to the second mirror that we're looking at right now. And I really wanted to do this talk without bringing this person up, but it's impossible. And you can probably guess, I'm going to say Donald Trump. He is a mirror to us. His rise to power is a reflection of the toxic masculinity and displays of wealth that are seen as something to aspire to for many millions of Americans. What does that say about us? That he wasn't quickly, emphatically, universally rejected. It certainly says something about privilege of white, rich men, but it also says something about our shadow. So I'm going to stay with him for just a minute because I want us to see him not as a polarizing political figure, but as a fellow human being. As I believe Wayne pointed out, I know it's really hard. I'm sorry. We have to do it. As a fellow and a damaged human being, I don't think anybody would quibble with that. And he is a fascinating example of our collective shadow coming out sideways and being destructive. When he was elected, I had a sense that his success was because of all that our culture has repressed, which shows up as a rejection of our shadow. And as I thought about it, it seemed to be captured in a shorthand of thinking about the 7 deadly sins. He's a full embodiment of all 7 deadly sins. And so instead of listing the proof of that, I'm going to read them off and pause to just give you a moment to pull up your own example in your mind, just to kind of set the tone. Pride, covetousness, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, sloth. It's not much of a stretch. So I think we can agree that Trump is a manifestation of the dark side of our collective shadow, just as Obama was in many ways a manifestation of our collectively unrealized golden shadow, the unexpressed part of us that felt powerful and creative and hopeful. It'd be tempting to say that since Obama was a representation of the golden side and Trump is the dark part, why did we have to go through Trump? Why couldn't we have just kept on this path of the golden shadow? But if Trump had not happened, we wouldn't have been as confronted so directly and so necessarily with our own shadow, with our country's shadow. And that country, and as we've seen over the past few years, that shadow contains racism. It contains revisionist, whitewashed history, misogyny, homophobia, xenophobia. And that darkness has always been there. We just didn't see it, or we didn't want to see it. And now that a mirror has been held up to us, we have to look at it. And that's not a bad thing, even though it's uncomfortable. It's fairly easy to see how those who support Trump experience him as an expression of their repressed desires. It's like his obvious displays of pride, lust, gluttony, etc., give them an opportunity to live vicariously through him. It's as if he's telling them, these things that everyone tells you that are bad, actually they aren't. And you're not a bad person for wishing for them. And I thought about our C3 values as I was putting this together, and I was particularly honing in on the final one about well-being and our interconnectedness. And when I think about interconnectedness with Trump supporters, it's easy to see the interconnectedness of the people who rally behind their preferred politician. But where I'm guessing it's a stretch is to say, how are we, who might not support him or identify with his supporters, how are we interconnected with them? After all, we are outraged by their behavior. We find ourselves activated by it. And if Carl Jung were here, and he was asked about this, he probably would offer his insightful but uncomfortable observation that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And even then, it's tempting to say, yeah, but they're different. There's no way we have anything in common. And there's no way in a million years that I would behave as badly as they do. And what have we learned about that? That if you say, no way, never me, that's a pretty good indication that there's something in yourself that you're not owning, not acknowledging. Again, from Jung, he said, whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as an event. It will find a way to show up, whether we like it or not. And those deadly sins were named for a reason. They're impulses that we all have. To shift back to our own personal experiences, the sins represent behaviors that we learn at an early age aren't okay. If we display any of them, even in a way that's age appropriate, because we're sort of stretching the boundaries and trying to figure out what's acceptable, we're told that the behavior is bad, or we're told that we are bad. And back that sin goes down into the shadow. And if it stays trapped and it's never explored, it will come out sideways in inappropriate ways that hurt us and the people around us. And if people never find healthy ways to express pride or lust or anger, our interconnectedness causes it to rise up in a disruptive social upheaval. And that brings us to the third mirror, and that's cancel culture. And I've realized as I've talked about this, not everyone knows what cancel culture is, or they're not familiar with the term. It's usually a public figure, often a celebrity, could be a politician, just anyone in the public eye who has a transgression, commits one of these sins. And they go kind of one step too far, and it might be criminal and it might not. But our reaction is to cancel them, to say, to just sort of want to erase them from the history books, to erase them from our society. It first kind of came up for me, or at least my awareness, was Bill Cosby. It's not that he didn't deserve to be punished, but degrees were rescinded, scholarships were renamed. It's like we wanted to just say he didn't exist. And that's cancel culture, or at least one example of that. If we've rejected the behaviors that I was talking about a moment ago, especially those sins, and we've labeled them as deplorable, then we will wake up one day and find ourselves looking them directly in the face. And that's what happens when we find out someone that we have admired has done something terrible. And in particular, it's usually pride, lust, or gluttony that are their downfall. And these are sins that many of us experience every single day. And I put the word sins in quotes because I think using that word is part of the problem. We've demonized natural impulses, not fully appreciating that there's nuance in everything and that there's a healthy and an unhealthy side to every impulse that we have. When we look only at the unhealthy side, healthy expressions of those impulses can be repressed. The easiest one that I thought of was pride. There's gloating and immature ways to say, I'm fantastic, yay, yay me. And there are celebratory ways to express you feeling good about yourself. But when we see pride as a sin, even a sincere and generous sharing of success can be rejected because it's seen as too prideful. It activates the part of us that thinks we're not worthy, that if somebody else wins, we lose. So we have to keep that person from getting too big for their britches. What's interesting is that many of the people who were called to task in the last couple of years and fell to cancel culture, like Louis C.K., Bill Cosby, Roseanne Barr, there was a pattern of bad behavior that was either known privately to a few people or it was widely known. And despite that pattern, they were allowed to continue to do their thing. I've been thinking about why would that be the case, besides there might be some obvious things about privilege. And the best I can come up with is that this is one of the silver linings of the 2016 election. I wonder if the mob mentality that kicks in to cancel someone out when they go one step too far is almost an extreme reaction that's trying to right the wrong of not canceling Trump when we had the chance. Like we're living the proverb, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. It seems like before, when we learned about people's transgressions and mistakes, instead of completely shunning them, we waited for some sort of comeback story. We were more likely to forgive, to remember that people are complicated and that no one is all good or bad. And now, as a society, we have an impulse to reduce people down to their worst deeds. We want to lock them up and throw away the key and wipe their name from the history books. And how does that cross paths with our shadow? If we can project all of those bad behaviors onto someone else, we don't have to own any part of ourselves that might be inclined towards those same bad behaviors. If we don't confront the shadow, like we learned last week, we won't grow up. Remember how Kent ended his talk last week? He talked about what he called the crusader effect, when our disowned qualities go on a rampage. He said the I, and here I'm thinking broadly of society, puts the repressed problem on the other. And not only is the other the problem, but the other needs to be gotten rid of. If I can scapegoat them and get rid of them, then everything will be okay in the world and things will be returned to their rightful balance. And that's the opportunity right now to notice where the crusader effect has kicked in. Our shadow is popped up in the form of othering. And in light of that, we can do a few things. We can cancel it out. We can stuff it back in its box and say that what all those people did was wrong and it doesn't have anything. It's all about them. It has nothing to do with us. Or we can look at the shadow that surfaced because of their actions and see what it would be like to be in relationship with it. You might be thinking, what in those people could possibly be a reflection of me? I had nothing to do with Roseanne Barr's racism or Bill Cosby being a sexual predator. And that's true. No one in here is responsible for their bad acts. That said, we play a role as members of an interconnected society, as part of the culture that supported their career and supported their actions, albeit indirectly. We have a habit of putting celebrities up on pedestals and holding them to impossible standards. And when they fall, we pity them at best and we cancel them at worst. Another habit is holding them to standards that aren't high enough. We assume that they're eventually going to misbehave, and we kind of take a secret pleasure in seeing their downfall, taking it all in through tabloid magazines and clickbait. So what is our role in their demise? We place pressure on them to be perfect, or to be the bad boy, or the good girl, or the bad girl. We typecast them, expecting them to always be a certain way. We give them almost unlimited power and contribute to their wealth, which gives them a sense of being untouchable and beyond the normal rules of right and wrong. And when they act out, they attract more attention. They probably make more money. They sell, media sells more magazines and they get more clicks. And a little voyeurism is natural because it actually gives us valuable information about social norms. But the problem is when it crosses a line. And cash and clicks let the media know that we want more. And the more disgusting and the more it taps into the shadow, the better. We should also remember that when we try to cancel someone, we're indirectly saying that they are beyond forgiveness and redemption. We're almost assuming that they're not capable of growth and change. And if they're a reflection of something in us that we don't want to see, does that mean that we're saying we're not capable of growth and change? And when it comes to cancel culture, we're not just canceling a person, we're canceling an opportunity to explore our shadow. That's one reason I hope that this is a phase that we're going through that evolves into something that's more mature and introspective. The fourth shadow that I find interesting comes from a kind of unexpected place: mockery, satire, and comedy. The themes that pop up on the comedy circuit are a reflection of our collective shadow. Comedians frequently touch on taboo subjects and say what we're all thinking or feeling, but we're afraid to say. In contrast, mockery and satire are often more focused on shaming someone or putting them in their place. Those are ways of pushing the shadow away and making sure that it stays attached to someone else. Satire, to me, often feels smarter than mockery. And maybe that's because we've seen it professionalized through things like The Onion or Stephen Colbert or Saturday Night Live. To me, satire at least has the potential to start a conversation, whereas mockery basically feels kind of mean and insulting. But thoughtful comedy has a way of getting us to put down our guard. Maybe it's because the comedian is mocking and revealing truths about themselves, which, that self-deprecating humor, and that makes it a little safer. They seem to know that if they're going to judge others, they have to judge themselves first. And for our part, what we laugh at the most, what makes us squirm, and what offends us points to aspects of our shadow that we need to look at more closely. So I want to close by sharing two ideas that give me hope for understanding these dynamics and give us an opportunity to dance with our shadow a bit more gracefully. And first is the concept of disowned selves, which I was introduced to through learning about voice dialogue about 10 years ago. Voice dialogue is a therapeutic technique and method. It was developed by two psychologists, one in more Freudian leaning, the other Jungian, named Hal and Sidra Stone back in the 70s. And it's another way of looking at that pie that Kent introduced us to last week. If you remember, it's that, a pie representing our wholeness, and that our aware ego, our self, is just a little slice of that pie, and everything else is in the shadow. And the basic explanation of voice dialogue is that we have a multitude of selves living within us at any given time. And you've directly encountered those selves anytime you've said, well, part of me thinks this, and part of me thinks that. Or on the one hand this, or on the other hand that. It's presenting that sort of often competing interests that we have in front of us, or that tension between maybe wanting to do the right thing and feeling like you want to not do the right thing. A simple example might be if you're trying to decide if you want to stay in a job or quit it. The part of you that's responsible wants security, likes routine, avoids risk, and doesn't want to disappoint people says, I should stay. The part of you that craves excitement, likes a good challenge, doesn't care what other people think, and wants to turn your life upside down says, I should quit. And all of those parts are working for your attention. And both of them have a point. What wins depends on how we've distributed those parts into our primary selves or our disowned selves. And the primary selves are those handful of traits that have been affirmed since we were little kids. It's usually we have about a half dozen of them, and they're what we've learned are socially acceptable to present to other people. And Jung might bring all those together and say that's your persona. And some examples of the primary selves that we're probably all familiar with are the people pleaser, the caregiver, the achiever, the responsible one, the performer, the perfectionist. Those are all things, they're often, you could also see them as roles that we might take in our family. Those are the ones that we learn give us the most success, get us the most kudos and affirmation. And this is that 25% of the pie that we know about ourselves. And those are the traits that make up our aware ego. And then there's everything else. There's the other 75%. And those behaviors or characteristics that are rejected by others. And they end up left in the disowned selves in that shadow. And those traits usually show up pretty early and they were punished or subdued or rejected in some way. For example, a child has a silly streak and likes to wear their clothes inside out, and they're told, that's weird. A young person who likes to draw is told, there's no money in art, you need to get your head out of the clouds. Or a friend who's excited about winning a competition is told, just be quiet, don't rub it in. When you witness one of those disowned selves showing up in someone, like one of your disowned selves showing up in someone else, the other person may be enthusiastic, they're an accomplished artist, or they're kind of a fun, quirky dresser. You either judge them or you praise them as being something that you could never be. You're not conscious of why you're doing it. It just happens. So you can see how that would show up in our culture. Whatever we've disowned, and I think it's often related to pride, lust, gluttony, and anger, has to show up somewhere. So we anoint celebrities and public figures to serve as our shadow surrogates. They have to live out the confidence, sexuality, material wealth, and passion for us. I think that's why we have, like, our royalty is Hollywood. That's why we sort of follow and almost glorify these people, because they're showing something that we wish on some level we had. So if we don't learn to be in relationship with our disowned selves, we'll continue this cycle, and public figures will continue to disappoint us, and we won't make our ego-aware slice of the pie any bigger. And if we're willing to dance with our shadow, we'll expand our self-awareness and get closer to being more of who we really are. The hard part is that these disowned selves, and Kent alluded to this last week, what keeps them active and what means that, the reason why we need to pay attention to them is because they really have an agenda of wanting to protect you on some level. They want to protect you from rejection or failure or loss or embarrassment. Your primary selves are attached to staying comfortable and unchallenged. So your persona isn't going to get very excited about trying to be in dialogue with any one of these disowned selves, and that threatens their identity too much. That means you have to find safe ways to explore these parts of yourself. You could try, and I've done this and I've recommended it to clients, try journaling from the perspective of your primary and disowned selves, especially the disowned self. If it helps to personify it, give it a name, like the good girl or the rebel. Another way to explore it is through books, art, and television. I realized a few years ago that my attraction to the dark and twisted worlds of Stephen King when I was in my early teens was probably because my outer life, I have felt I had to be a good girl. It was all sugar and spice and everything nice. And that was my outlet for exploring sort of that darker side of human nature. And I still read the occasional dark book, but now it manifests in watching really dark foreign crime shows. Thank you, Netflix. In those, it's all about the psychological drama. It's all about watching these characters poke around in their shadow. So notice what you're drawn to and reflect on what's attractive about it. If you feel both an attraction and a repulsion to something, you can bet that there's an opportunity to explore some aspect of your shadow. There's also a more outward-facing approach that we can take to be more fluent in our ego shadow awareness, and that's learning how to talk about taboo topics. Here's a really good quote for you. Being taught to avoid talking about politics and religion has led to a lack of understanding about politics and religion. What we should have been taught was how to have a civil conversation about politics and religion. Isn't that a great quote? I think we could all agree with that. And I've thought about this quote a lot. My husband shared it on my Facebook wall because he knew that it would resonate with me. And in wanting to share it today, I thought it didn't have a source. There was no attribution to the quote on Facebook, so I spent a little bit of time researching it. Most of the time when it's shared online, there's no attribution. But when there is an attribution, it's always the same person. Ryan Fournier, founder and co-chairman of Students for Trump. Yeah. What does that say about me? That after I found out it was him, I hate the quote now. Oh, I know, right? What does it say? That it's like that changes our perception. Like after I kept finding evidence it was him, I'm like, okay, there's got to be more. He's got to be quoting someone else. It's something he tweeted back in like 2018. So I kept searching for an alternative answer, one that supported my worldview, that said only liberals are interested in having these sorts of civil conversations and trying to find out what divides us and how we can bridge that difference. I thought, that can't be right. A Trump supporter couldn't have possibly said that. Where did it really come from? Now, that's a rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down right now, but I do intend to keep researching it. I'm a little stubborn. But the fact is, it's still a brilliant quote, no matter the source, that speaks a profound truth. We have tossed out not only politics and religion into the dark, but also money, sex, race. That has led to not only a lack of understanding and inability to talk about it, but by putting those topics into the category of we don't go there, we don't talk about that, we've made those topics themselves unacceptable and sometimes even shameful. Somehow we need to learn how to talk about the tough stuff. We need to learn how to work through our self-righteousness and embrace humility. Only then can we find some common ground. I facilitated a small group discussion earlier this week after an event at GVSU. And even though there were mixed political opinions in the room and people were not shy about expressing them, there were also moments when everyone was nodding their heads and saying yes to one another. So it is possible. It can happen. My friend Julie recently said something to me. She said, my goal isn't to change hearts and minds. It's to open hearts and minds. That has a completely different feel when we talk about, talking about these difficult topics. It transforms the conversation and the energy. And that approach is less threatening to our primary selves, the ego part that is attached to a certain identity. And it allows us to consider pieces of our shadow that might be holding doubts or fears. The goal is not to change our shadow, but to recognize, understand, and integrate shadow aspects that lead to personal growth. Another way we can expand our conscious awareness and therefore project less of our shadow out into the world is to ask ourselves, whenever there's a cancel culture moment, whenever we find ourselves activated by a family member or a friend or colleague or politician or Facebook post, how can this person or situation be my teacher? This means we have to shift from being a judge to being a student. We have to get curious. What feelings are being activated in me? This just requires going a little bit below, the knee-jerk response. What makes me feel so strongly about this? When have I experienced this before? What in my core identity is being challenged? What does this reaction tell me about myself? And where do I need to dig in more? The last thing I'll add, which is to reinforce the readings that we've heard today, is a basic reminder. No one is perfect. Good people do bad things. We are messy, complex creatures with messy, complex lives and relationships and motives. If we give ourselves the grace of knowing that there's a shadow side that's working on us even when we can't see it, it's important that we extend that grace to others. That doesn't mean that bad behavior shouldn't have consequences. It just means we have to look at the totality of the person, including the culture that they're living in, the one that we have co-created, before we hand down any kind of sentence. Just because they're a good person who does a bad thing doesn't mean that they should be absolved. My suggestion is that in that evaluation process, we take a pause and we don't skip over the self-reflective part. We shouldn't try to avoid a trial. We should look at all the evidence, hear from witnesses that might offer conflicting statements, and look for a way to come out of the experience having learned something life-affirming. And because I love it so much, and it shares a message for the times we live in multiple layers, I want to leave you with the words of Bob Marley. And I actually want to invite you to flip over you've probably already gone to the second side, but I want you to say it with me, this first part of the song. This is from 1962. So just join me starting with the second line. Don't you look at me so smug and say I'm going bad. Who are you to judge me and the life that I live? I know that I'm not perfect, and that I don't claim to be. So before you point your fingers, make sure your hands are clean. The CDC would agree. Thank you.